We've been looking at the phenomena creating biodiversity using the analogy of a pizza in which some ingredients, those used to make the main part of the pizza base, are required in large amounts and take a long time to obtain, equivalent to the dominant species in the plant community, and some ingredients are needed in much smaller amounts but are varied and make the pizza interesting, equivalent to the scarcer or subordinate species in the plant community. But what happens when someone sprinkles chocolate on your pizza? In plant communities, some of the local biodiversity has arrived only recently in the form of alien or exotic species with their origins very often on different continents. Until now, we've been looking at this dry grassland community in terms of native species and native biodiversity. Species that have evolved nearby and are adapted to local conditions and ecology. But even here, alien plant and animal species have arrived and could potentially change the ecosystem. As the season progresses, these species have become more frequent here, and crucially, alien species are more evident in the patches of land that have not yet been mown or managed, or have been abandoned by their owners. So here there are actually two main themes to explore. Firstly, the succession or development of the vegetation, but also how management is key to invasion as a process and keeping invasive species in check. So firstly, in the main grassland, alien species are rare, but I have found them this year, usually near the edge of the grassland along what we call the ecotone, or where one vegetation type blends into another. Also within the grassland itself, I found a few scattered plants of annual fleabane, Erigeron annuus, a North American species that was introduced to Europe in the 17th century as an ornamental plant. There are also some plants of Chinese mugwort, Artemisia verlotiorum, which spread across Europe during the early 20th century as fragments of plant material in soil surrounding the roots of imported trees and shrubs. But not all alien species are invasive, and indeed there's a range from casual aliens, which need a continuous input of seeds or material to sustain the population and can't persist spontaneously, through naturalized species, or aliens with self-sustaining populations but which do not spread, to invasive species which spread aggressively over long distances. Just to be clear, all of the alien species found here are usually considered to be invasive species or aggressive agricultural weeds. But the fact that I only found a few individuals of these species shows that something must be stopping them from taking over. We've already seen that the plant community is composed of a few dominant stress tolerator species, and the subordinate and transient species tend to have a range of ecological strategies and opportunistically occupy the microscale niches between the clumps of the dominant plants. The alien species are essentially transient species, represented by one or two individuals that are not suitably adapted to be dominant, and which are, in a sense, attempting to survive in a place that is already occupied by more appropriately adapted species. They don't immediately achieve dominance because they're too late to the party, a phenomenon known as biotic resistance. So biotic resistance is essentially a low invasibility on the part of the plant community. And invasion as a process doesn't just depend on the characteristics of the alien species, but also on the state of the existing plant community. And plant communities with high species richness are not easily invaded. This is crucial to understand because on the one hand, I might say that invasive species are not a problem for this resilient species-rich community, but on the other hand, I know that this dry grassland depends on management by the landowner, a guy called Massimo. And if he changes the way the land is used, or abandons or sells the land, then the alien species are sitting there waiting for things to change as nuclei of future colonization. So the real danger is that alien species can become invasive if they're present and the environmental conditions change in a way that favors them. And we can see this in patches of grassland owned by other people that in this particular year haven't mown or managed the land. Just above Massimo's plot is an olive grove where the grassland hasn't been mown and the plants are much larger. Some of these are native species, increasing the local native biodiversity, also of dependent animal species. For example, We've been seeing plenty of flower and pollen-eating beetles in this grassland, most of which are relatively small. I found rose chafers, a native species that is larger than the other beetles and needs larger quantities of pollen and flowers to sustain it. And it seems to be associated with these larger native plants. But alongside the native species, I also found a number of invasive aliens, and notably the lack of management, evidently for more than one season, has led to invasion by one of the most notorious invasive tree species, Tree of Heaven, Ailanthus altissima. This is a clear demonstration of the importance of management, but it also reflects the ecological process of succession, in the sense that management resets the succession and doesn't allow these larger woody species to survive. And the presence of Tree of Heaven essentially represents a kind of perverted succession, diverted away from the natural progression towards, in this particular case, oak hornbeam woodland, towards something resembling a subtropical Asian forest. Incidentally, I also found a single plant of Chinese fan palm, Trachycarpus fortuni, and several plants of black locust, Robinia pseudoacacia, which are also aggressively invasive species, but these are currently under control here. Black locust also has its fans because its copious flowers and nectar production can support quality honey production, and there are beehives here that will actually benefit from this. And the wood is actually useful, although ecologically its spread across Europe from Paris in the 17th century has been a disaster for broadleaf woodlands. Until now, we've been considering the direct effects of alien plant invasion on local plant diversity, but not all invasive species are plants, and not all have direct effects on plant diversity. In part 3, I talked about the patchiness and heterogeneity and the small-scale agricultural use of this land, and I briefly showed that one of the crops here is grapevine. This year, fruit crops in northern Italy have suffered the massive invasion of the so-called Japanese scarab beetle, Popillia japonica. Milan is served by 3 international airports, and the first reported sighting of this beetle in Europe was near Milan in 2014. Incidentally, it has been invasive in North America since the early 20th century, but has only just made it to Milan and so to Europe. Over the last year, populations of this species have exploded in northern Italy, illustrating the effect of predator release, or when an alien species finds itself in a new geographic range when none of its natural predators are present and it's free to multiply. Personally, I've seen Popillia on fruit trees in orchards where people usually notice it, but also in grasslands around Milan, where it damages shrubs such as alder buckthorn, Frangula alnus, and hazel, Corylus avellana, but, and this is the most worrying observation, decimating the topmost leaves of native trees, such as the black poplar. This is the detail from the top of one tree that I found, but looking across the landscape I can imagine millions of trees supporting millions of beetles. If this is a problem that affects trees and shrubs, why is this important to our grassland biodiversity? Well, don't forget that the grassland exists in part due to the economic activities that the owner decides to do there. So coming back to Massimo's grapevine plants, he told me that a few weeks ago each single plant was covered in thousands of beetles. And looking at them today, I also found that many beetles were still present. Massimo cultivates his crops organically, so he didn't want to spray huge amounts of pesticides on the plants, and tried his best with materials that he had to hand, such as copper sulfate and anti-hail netting. But these were ineffective against the small and resistant beetle. This is important to the local plant diversity, because that depends on Massimo and what he decides to do with the land. If he decides that the current crops will not produce, and changes the land use, or sells it or abandons it, then the invasive beetle effectively threatens the existence of the grassland. In practice, this ecosystem has survived invasions by invasive insects in the past. Thankfully, the predator release effect doesn't last forever, as local predators and disease organisms learn to exploit the invasive species and start to reduce their population sizes. So this wave of Popillia is likely to be an extreme event that eventually leads to a new normal, in which it exists as just another background problem that occasionally builds up to an acute threat. Coming back to the plant diversity found in the grassland, the message is that invasive species can have direct and indirect effects that are mediated by the economic activity and management decisions. In a sense, this is good news for protected areas such as natural parks, because a few individuals can make management decisions that favour native biodiversity.